Hello everyone. This is going to be our video lecture on the central nervous system. My plan is to cover the intro material all the way through the cerebrum for this video, and then we'll do a part 2 video with the remaining parts of the brain. Just like we would if we were meeting in person, anything that's really important, I'm going to make sure that I emphasize. If there's something that you don't need to know, I will tell you you don't need to know that. How about that? So here's our outline. Like I said, my goal for this first video is to get through the beginning part through the cerebrum, and then we will do the rest in part 2 of the video. All right. So by now, we've already introduced the structure of the nervous system. We know that there are 2 parts of the nervous system. The central nervous system, which is this chapter, has the brain and spinal cord. That's it. And because the central nervous system has the brain and spinal cord, we know that the function of the central nervous system is more about processing because it has the brain and spinal cord. The other part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of all the peripheral nerves. And these include the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. And of course, this part of the nervous system contains the axons of the neurons. So this is going to be more about sending nerve impulses. There's really no part of the peripheral nervous system that does any processing. So the peripheral nerves are just going to send nerve impulses. And of course, you remember that we talked about those nerve impulses in the previous chapter, the action potential, the graded potential. I can tell you're smiling, all that good stuff. All right, cool. So this chapter is on the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Here we go. Because it's the brain and spinal cord, as we already said, the function is really going to be about processing information. And of course, that includes a lot of things. Sometimes processing information means the frontal lobe of the brain trying to help us make a decision. Other times, processing information in the brain means that it helps to send nerve impulses to our heart and our organs to keep them going. Sometimes processing information means that it helps to carry out a reflex to protect us. Other times, processing information means that it helps to keep our balance and our motor skills, and that would be the cerebellum. So processing information incorporates a lot of stuff, which we're going to talk about. But that's really the main function of the brain and parts of the spinal cord. All right, so in this chapter, we're really going to just go through the structures of the brain. That's what we're going to start with. And we'll go through each structure and we'll talk about its function. All right, so we're going to start with the covering. Covering the spinal cord and brain is a layer of protective coverings called the meninges. We've already talked about this in the lab. You can see their skull. We already know that. The outer bone covering is the skull. Underneath the skull is 3 layers of a protective covering, collectively known as the meninges. Make sure you know these 3 layers. The outermost layer is the dura mater. It's leathery and tough. The middle layer is called the arachnoid matter, or some may call it the arachnoid space. This is where we find the little spider-like extensions and a little space with fluid and blood vessels. And the innermost lining, which looks like saran wrap, very thin, clinging directly to the brain and the spinal cord, is the pia mater. The idea here is, of course, protection. It also is going to contain some cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to protect because it gives buoyancy. It provides nutrients, and it also allows us to get rid of some wastes. Okay, so let's talk about it. The outermost covering is the dura mater, and I love this picture up top because it really shows you what it looks like. It's kind of whitish in color, but it is thick, all right? This is the tough outermost layer right up against the skull. Those are the things to know. Tough outermost layer right up against the skull. As you move further in, we see the arachnoid space. In this picture on the bottom, the arachnoid space is between here and here. By the way, the dura mater actually has 2 different layers, but you don't need to know those different layers. You just need to know the dura mater. All right, so the arachnoid space has all these spider-like extensions. That's where it gets the name arachnoid. And importantly, this is where we allow the blood vessels. My friends, we gotta get blood vessels into the brain, and we gotta protect those blood vessels. So this arachnoid space is where we bring in those blood vessels to the brain. And it's also where we see, so we contain the blood vessels, and this is where we have the cerebrospinal fluid coursing through. All right, and then the innermost layer is called the pia mater. Very thin, so it's the deepest. It's very thin, delicate, and it clings directly to the brain and spinal cord. And if I go back for a second, this picture on this side, if you look at the brain, we can see the cerebral cortex with the gyri and the sulci. There's like a little sheen to it. And I give the analogy of saran wrap, right? Or as we use in this household, Stretch Tight, because it's better, folks. Check it out. But we can see you see that sheen? It looks like saran wrap, and it clings to every nook and cranny. You can see some examples of what can go wrong. You don't need to know those. Hydrocephalus is when we get a excessive buildup of cerebrospinal fluid, and it looks really bad, and it can be really bad, water on the brain. Mostly the danger comes from the fact that the pressure builds up inside the brain. And then meningitis would be an infection inside the meninges. So get it? Meningitis. Itis is inflammation, and then inflammation of the meninges. But you don't need to know those. All right. I've given you some examples here of different hematomas that can form. This is extra. But now that you know the 3 layers of the meninges, we could better understand where these hematomas are placed. Epidural. Epi means outside, right? So a hematoma that's an epidural hematoma means that the swelling is gathering outside of the meninges. So it's between the skull and the dura mater. Subdural means that the swelling is accumulating underneath the dura. Sub, like a subbasement, means below. So a subdural hematoma would mean that the swelling is between the dura mater and the arachnoid. And then the intracerebral would be any type of swelling that's just inside the cerebrum, not necessarily within the layers of the brain. You don't need to know these, folks. Just giving you some clinical information so that you can remember why we're talking about this stuff. All right. I've already mentioned cerebrospinal fluid. Let's just make sure that we talk about it. We know that it is found in the arachnoid space. And remember, it's going to circulate around the covering of the brain. And that's why I like this picture, because it has some arrows. It's going to travel around the covering of the brain. But remember, this covering goes around the spinal cord too. So you can see that it's going to go all the way down the spinal cord, all the way back up the spinal cord. So this cerebrospinal fluid is always circulating. I think the book said at any given point in time, we have about a 1/4 cup, maybe it was a 1/2 cup, I think it was a 1/4, of cerebrospinal fluid. So it doesn't seem that much, but if you think about how small that space is, it's a considerable amount, and it's really important. So, as we said, it gives buoyancy, and that's a form of protection, because it kind of gives buoyancy to the brain and spinal cord. So if there's a blow to the brain, the fact that there's water around it, there's cerebrospinal fluid around it, gives some protection. So it's a cushioning, it's protection. This cerebrospinal fluid allows to bring in certain nutrients, and it also allows us to maintain pH, because we can bring in certain things or take out certain things to maintain the pH. Really, really important. Cerebrospinal fluid is actually pretty similar to the plasma in our bloodstream, which is mostly water. So it's water. It's got a little bit more dissolved things in it. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about what are the spaces in which the cerebrospinal fluid travels through the brain. Because not only does that cerebrospinal fluid travel around the brain, like I showed you with these red arrows. Let me change color. Oh, how about green? This cerebrospinal fluid also travels a little bit into the brain. Not into the cerebrum per se, but into the diencephalon. Okay, back through the cerebellum. So when we get to inside of the brain, the hollow chambers that this fluid travels through are called ventricles. Okay? So not only does the cerebrospinal fluid travel up and around the covering of the brain and spinal cord, but because the brain is kind of big, we need this cerebrospinal fluid to travel a little bit into the brain itself. And the ventricles are these hollow chambers inside of the brain. Hollow chambers inside of the brain that act as passageways for this cerebrospinal fluid. For my class, you don't need to know the specific ventricles. Just know as a whole what they are. Some things to point out. These ventricles are connected, which makes sense because we need to have a constant flow of this fluid. And these are the hollow chambers inside the brain that allow cerebrospinal fluid to course through it. Here's a picture. These blue areas are meant to show you the hollow cavities inside. Good stuff, right? And we're not done yet because on this picture, you can see these little reddish or pinkish clusters. There's one right there, and there's one right there. These red clusters are called, each of them is called a choroid plexus. And the function of these clusters is that they produce cerebrospinal fluid. All right? So this is a living, moving fluid. So it courses around the brain, through the brain, around the spinal cord. And, it's constantly being cleansed and replaced, much like our own bloodstream. So the choroid plexi, so one of my kitties just came in. Okay, thank you. She brought one of her favorite toys that we call the babies. Kima, don't you know I'm recording a lecture? They don't know. So these little choroid plexi dangle down. They produce cerebrospinal fluid. And not only that, they clean it. They filter it. So we want to be able to keep this fluid the appropriate composition. And you can see before it was a half cup. I was wrong. So the total volume is about a half cup. You don't need to know that number. It was just meant to give you an idea. All right, so really important, the choroid plexi. They're actually clusters of capillaries, but they produce cerebrospinal fluid and they cleanse it and filter it. I mean, folks, we're learning already. I'm excited, but I'm always excited. Okay, so I just want to touch upon some of the blood supply to the brain. Now, the good news is you do not, that's the general sign for do not, you do not need to know all of these. In A&P2, we're going to be spending a whole chapter on the blood vessels. So we'll talk about, for example, the cerebral arteries, we'll talk about the carotid arteries, the jugular veins that go up to the brain. But I just want to make a point here, even though we haven't gotten to the blood vessels yet. Obviously, the brain is highly vascular. So you can see this picture on the bottom that shows all the branches of the arteries supplying the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum. And I just think it's really cool. Once again, our body's done a really cool thing. It's very efficient. At the base of the cerebrum, we can see this circular structure, and I've enlarged it up here. This is called the Circle of Willis. And if you're old like me, of course, you're going to want to make the joke, what's she talking about, Willis? Look it up. But you can see we have this circular structure called the Circle of Willis, and it's at the base of the cerebrum. And then it's really kind of like a traffic circle where all of the really important arterial branches come off that feed the brain. You don't need to know any of this. I'm just making a point. Obviously, you do know that the brain is very vascular. This is extra also, but sometimes we can have a problem in the blood vessels going up to the brain. And if they believe that there might be a clot, maybe there was a clot somewhere else in the body that broke free, and the two places you worry about that embolism, which is a broken free clot, the two places you worry about that blood clot getting caught would be the lungs or the brain. So a cerebral embolism or a pulmonary embolism. So if you're talking about the brain, they can put some dye in there, in the blood vessels, take a picture, and this is what you would look for. This is what you would see in the angiogram, and you'd look for areas where there's not a whole lot of blood flow, indicating that there's someplace previous to that, upstream, where there was a blockage. And you would look for areas like this, where it looks like the blood vessels kind of burst. Okay. Dangerous situation, but you don't need to know that. All right. I would like you to know the blood-brain barrier. So, what this is a very strict, tight lining of tissue around the brain. There's a lot of information on here. Let me just try and simplify it for you. So it's a very tight, protective layer of tissue around the brain. And see, because we've done such a good job earlier this semester, we can pull on that knowledge. Because we talked about selective permeability, remember? We talked about the idea that the plasma membrane around a cell, you know what it is, that phospholipid bilayer. Well, we talked about the idea of that phospholipid bilayer is to have selective permeability, because we need some things to come into the cell, water, glucose, etc. And we need to be able to get some things out of the cell, carbon dioxide, waste products. So we need to bring some things in and out, but we don't want to let everything in, like bacteria. The idea of the blood-brain barrier is that the protective layers of tissue around the brain have even stricter selective permeability. So this barrier, which is made up of epithelial cells, so you can see right here, tight junctions. The epithelial cells around the central nervous system blood vessels, I'm going to put BV for blood vessels. The epithelial cells around the blood vessels have very tight junctions, and we did that also earlier this semester when we talked about how cells join together to form tissues. It could be a tight junction, it could be a desmosome, could be a gap junction. See, I thought you could forget it, but not so fast, my friends. Well, these epithelial cells have an even tighter junction than usual. And there's actually some other things that make up this blood-brain barrier in addition to these epithelial cells. But we don't have to know the specifics. I'm just saying it's a very tight, protective layers of tissue. And it's tighter than anywhere else in the body. And this is really important. It still can allow some things in. I'm not going to ask you the specifics of what it can allow in, but it can still allow some things in. But it's tighter than other places in our body. And that makes sense. the brain is the most expensive real estate, right? Other parts of the body, if they get injured, we can probably heal it to a certain degree, but the brain, not so much. And this is extra, this slide is extra, but just making a point, FYI, because of that tight protective boundary, because of the blood-brain barrier, if you want to make a medication that's going to act inside the brain, you've got to make sure that you make that medication, you structure it so that it can get through the blood-brain barrier, which just takes different considerations than if you want to get a medication to other parts of the body. It is interesting though, some things can get through the blood-brain barrier, like alcohol, like nicotine. So alcohol happens to be very lipid soluble, so it really doesn't have a problem getting through the blood-brain barrier, which can be good if you want to relax after a long day, but it can also be bad, right? Okay. Here we are. So the good thing is that we've already covered this in lab. So you're going to already have some idea of the structures of the brain, where X, Y, and Z structures are. What we're going to add in the lecture part of this is the function. So you're already going to know the parts of the cerebrum, but now we're going to add the function. And then we're also going to add how these parts of the brain work together. Now, obviously, the brain is really complicated. We are only, this is good news to you, we're only going to be covering the basics, right? So I know it might be intimidating, but I think if you pay attention and you take notes on what I'm asking you to know, it tends to be pretty straightforward, okay? All right, so in the lab, I introduced how I like to separate the brain. And I prefer to separate the brain into 4 regions. So you should already be aware of, we have the cerebrum, the biggest, wormiest part. The cerebrum is the only part of the brain that has some functions that are voluntary or conscious. Then we're going to have the cerebellum, which is the cauliflower-looking thing on the back. We're going to have, have fun with colors. Let's choose pink. We're going to have the brainstem, which is the stem to the brain. And then, let's do black or dark gray. Then we're going to have this inner region, which I've put inside this yellow box called the diencephalon. For this first part of the video, we are going to cover the cerebrum, which is actually quite a bit to cover. And then we will do the rest of the parts of the brain and the spinal cord in part 2 of our central nervous system lecture. Okay, now, before we get to the structures of the cerebrum, this is a review, and I actually talked about this in our lecture on the nervous tissue. There's 2 different types of tissue in the brain and spinal cord, gray matter and white matter. And this is actually a picture of a sheep brain that's been cut in half through a sagittal cut. And you can see, oh, there's my kitty again. You can see that the inner portion looks a little bit lighter in color. And the lighter areas are considered to be white matter. And they have that white matter because they contain axons that in some areas are myelinated. So important stuff here. The lighter color tissue, we can see some in the cerebellum, is white matter, and it gets that whiter color or lighter color because that tissue is made up of axons, which many of them are myelinated, and that myelinated cover gives it that lighter look to it. Now, hold on. If we know that the white matter contains the axons, because remember, the main parts of a neuron, you know this, we're going to have the cell body, and then we're going to have the axon, which is the one long tail. So here's the axon. If we know that the white matter is made up mostly of axons, well, we can already figure out what the function of the white matter is going to be. So the function of the white matter, because it's axons, is to send nerve impulses. And that color doesn't really show up. So Let me change to a different color. The function of the white matter is really going to be to send nerve impulses because it's the axon. And that's what axons do. They send motor and sensory nerve impulses. There's really no processing going on there because we don't do any processing in the axon. Versus the gray matter. And the gray matter is going to look darker. And we can see the cerebral cortex, the outer rim of the cerebrum, is made up of gray matter. Check that out. Also, the outer parts of the cerebellum are gray matter. And the gray matter houses mostly cell bodies. And because the gray matter houses the cell bodies, can't we figure out what's going to be happening there? This is where the processing is happening. Processing. So the gray matter contains cell bodies, and therefore its function is going to be processing. The white matter contains axons, and therefore its function is going to be to send impulses, send nerve impulses. How about that? Bringing it all together. All right, let's take a global look at the cerebrum. We know it has two hemispheres, right? A right and a left. So right part of the brain, right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere. This is the biggest part of the brain. We know that the outer covering of the cerebrum has the gyri and sulci. So we already got this from lab. A gyrus is an elevation in the outer part of the cerebrum. And a sulcus is a depression. And what this does is it gives us more surface area so we can do more functioning. I told you in lab that the way that I remember sulci as being a depression is that if someone is depressed, they might sulk. So a sulci is a depression. We already know from lab, connecting the two cerebral hemispheres is a longitudinal fissure. Cool. Obviously, we know that each hemisphere of the cerebrum is going to be able to talk to each other. But indeed, each cerebral hemisphere tends to have some of its own specific functioning, even though there is some dual functioning. All right, so overall, the cerebrum. The cerebrum's going to do a lot of things, which we're going to talk about. What I want to point out right now is that the cerebrum is the only part of the brain that has some voluntary functions. If you want to initiate a voluntary muscle contraction, that's going to come from the cerebrum. Any conscious thought process, if you're having memories, if you're trying to make a decision, if you're studying and trying to think, anything that is conscious is going to come from the cerebrum. The rest we're going to talk about. All right, so we've already established that the outer part of the cerebrum has gray matter. Well, that outer part of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. Here it's labeled outer cortex. We're going to just call it the cerebral cortex. Really important. This is going to be where we do a lot of conscious thinking, a lot of initiating voluntary muscle contraction. Cortex means outer, so we're going to see this word again and again. We're going to see it in the renal cortex, which is the outer region of the kidney, etc. So the way that you'll be able to differentiate the cerebral cortex from the inner part of the cerebrum is the gray versus white matter. So the cerebral cortex is the outer region that's gray matter, cerebral cortex, and then the inner region of the cerebrum is white matter. Two parts, cerebral cortex, inner cerebrum. That cerebral cortex, you can see here a stat, 40% of brain mass. I'm not going to ask you that number, but I'm making a point. Because of all the sulci and gyri, because of that, we get a ton of surface area. So if you were to lay this out, you'd be surprised at how much cerebral cortex we actually have. This cerebral cortex is our voluntary part of the brain. Voluntary. Any type of voluntary thing when you're talking, communicating, memory, understanding, making decisions, initiating voluntary movements, cerebral cortex. I'm going to bang it into your head. Cerebral cortex, a voluntary part of the brain. Okay. Now, we are going to attempt to map out some parts of the cerebral cortex. This is not a high-level brain anatomy class, so we're not going to map out the cerebral cortex specifically. It is possible. We could map out the cerebral cortex to every little single area, and we could say pretty much what every little single area does. But we're not that high level, and that's fine for now because we're just getting the basics. So instead, we're going to talk about some of the regions of the cerebral cortex, and we're just going to pick a couple. So instead of mapping out every little square nanometer of the cerebral cortex, we're just going to pick a couple regions and talk about what they do. The first way, I think, that it's easiest to map out the cerebral cortex is by lobe. And these regions should sound familiar because the skull has parts that are named by lobe also. So of course, in pink, we have the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. And one of the main functions of the frontal lobe is going to be our primary motor areas. This is going to make sense in a little bit. We also have some speech areas here. But primary motor areas mean that we're going to have regions of the cerebral cortex in the frontal region that initiate motor contraction. So if you want to voluntarily contract a skeletal muscle, that's a motor nerve impulse action. Really, it's primarily going to be coming from the frontal region of the cerebral cortex. Parietal, we know to be this blue area, darker blue area. And one of the primary functions of the parietal cerebral cortex is sensory. So a lot of our nerve impulses that are coming up from the body are sensory nerve impulses, coming up from our skin, from our joints, from our muscles, but also sensory impulses coming up from our stomach and liver and intestines. They're going to go up to the parietal. So this is an area where we receive these sensory impulses. The very, very dark blue, kind of purplish, is the temporal. Here we're going to have a lot of function in hearing and taste. Hearing shouldn't be hard because temporal is right by our ear. But a lot of our taste information is processed in the temporal region. And then, of course, we have the occipital lobe, which is in the back. And the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex really has a lot of functions in vision. If you've ever heard someone say, oh, I got hit in the back of the head and I saw stars. One reason why is because, well, the back of the head, the occipital part of the cerebral cortex, this is where we have our areas for vision. So you might see stars, actually. But don't try that at home. So I would start here. We are going to get more specific, but as a general place to start, we can simply divide the cerebral cortex into these regions and identify a basic function. And of course, remember, we're talking about the cerebral cortex. We're only talking about that outer rim of gray matter. Yet it does so much for us. Having fun yet? Yes. Okay. Now, we're about to get more specific. Don't be afraid of this picture. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to ask you all of these, but as I said, it's possible to map out the regions very specifically. And we're going to give you a couple of examples. But before we do that, each specific area of the cerebral cortex is very specific in its function. So each specific area of the cerebral cortex is either a motor area, a sensory area, or an association area. And we're going to find that these areas work together. They have to, but each individual brain tissue can only be one of these three. So let's just start with an example. I'm going to draw a brain very badly, of course. There's my cerebellum, diencephalon, and brainstem. Wow, that's really bad. Okay. Let's use an example of vision. I think that's the best thing to do. So let's say that there's going to be a sensory area for vision in the occipital region of the cerebral cortex. Then there's going to be an association area for vision a little bit further over. And then there's going to be a motor area for vision way up here. So what I'm saying is every individual part of the cerebral cortex is either sensory, association, or motor. Now, I know that we just generalized. Remember, we just said that the frontal region does a lot of motor. And technically, this little M would be in the frontal region. We said that the parietal does a lot of sensory. So even though the parietal does a lot of sensory, it doesn't mean that all the sensory parts are there. Many of them are, but not all. We said that the temporal does a lot of hearing and taste. And then we said the occipital does a lot of vision. But within the occipital, within the area for vision, there's going to be some areas for vision that are sensory only. There's going to be some areas for vision that are association only. And I think this should make sense to you because each part of the brain, even our cells are very specific, right? Each cell specializes in one thing and it does that thing really well. We cannot ask one cell to do many things well. It's just like kind of in society, we have some people who do certain things really well and we go to them. So, you have someone who is a really good teacher. I'm not sure if I can think of an example, but so I may be I think I'm an okay teacher. I might be a really good teacher and that's my specialized skill, but I'm not really good at fixing cars. So if I need to fix my car, I'm going to go to somebody else who specializes in that. So our body is no different. So we have these different cells, and in this case, different neurons. And we already know this. We have some neurons that are sensory neurons. And that sensory neuron cell body, because remember the gray matter, it houses cell bodies. So if I'm talking about this red cell, this is going to be a sensory neuron. And a sensory neuron looks a little bit different than an interneuron, which would be the blue one, than a motor neuron cell body, which would be the green one. So this is how the parts of the brain work together. We're going to have information from the periphery. In this case, if it's vision, Maybe there's information from the eyeballs. It's my eyeball, really bad. We're going to have sensory information coming up. And that sensory information is going to go to a specific spot. Most of our sensory visual information is going to go to the occipital lobe. The only job of a sensory area is to receive that sensory information. It cannot receive it and process it. Instead, it's going to send that information over to an association neuron. The only job of that association area is to process it. And let's say that we get some kind of visual information. Ooh, that guy is really hot. So that's the sensory. It travels to the association neuron, which helps us make a decision. And of course, maybe there's other parts of our brain that are association that we're going to be involved in this decision making also. So maybe I have a memory. Wait, I think I've seen him before. Or I have other conscious thought processes. Well, I'm wearing a sweatshirt and jeans. I don't look very good, so I don't want to talk to him. Or maybe it's like, ooh, I'm actually wearing something kind of cute. Maybe I will talk to him. So these association areas can in fact talk to each other. But then those areas cannot send out a motor impulse. So they've got to deliver their plan to the motor areas. So if I decide that I'm looking good, then I'm going to want to walk over to that cute guy. So then the motor impulses to the muscles that are going to allow me to walk over there are actually initiated from here and go out the brain to the spinal cord, out to the muscles. Wow, are you following along there? The idea here, to summarize, each individual part of the cerebral cortex can only do one of these things. It can only receive sensory, it can only process, it can only send out motor. These parts of the brain that are specialized will talk to each other. And by the way, they'll talk to each other using the white matter, which has axons, which send nerve impulses. Really cool. All right, so I'm going to ask you to know some of these areas. We're going to have you know the ones that are starred, and I've divided them by whether they're a motor area of the cerebral cortex, association, or sensory. So these are the motor areas. I'm going to have you know the primary motor cortex, that's 1. Broca's area, which is motor for speech, that's 2. Sensory areas, the primary somatosensory, and then visual and auditory areas. That's 3, 4. I'm going to go back, don't worry. And then the association areas, I'm having you know 5, 6. That's it, right? Yes. So I'm having you know 1, 2, 3, these divided separate. 6 or 7, depending on how you count them. I don't think that's too bad, folks. Out of all the specific parts of the brain, I'm only asking you to know 7. Not so bad. And then I've divided them by the areas with red arrows are motor only. The areas with green arrows are sensory only. And the areas with blue arrows are association only. Okay, let's go through these. And remember, I asked you at the beginning to know the general functions of each region, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. So I would like you to keep those in mind and know those. But I'd also like you to know these 7 specific areas. Just to give you a little taste of the specifics. Okay, let's start with motor. Our primary motor cortex is this red strand. And it's going to go down both sides of the brain. So dare I say, it looks like a headband. So imagine a headband. It's a strip going across both cerebral hemispheres. It is technically in the frontal. region. And I know it kind of looks like it's pretty far back, but this is the dividing part between the frontal region of the cerebral cortex and the parietal. And indeed, what was the main function of the frontal lobe? Motor. So this strip, the primary motor cortex, this strip is our main area for sending motor impulses out. And we're talking about voluntary. So we're talking about skeletal muscle. If it is a motor impulse to a smooth or cardiac muscle, it's coming from either the hypothalamus or the brainstem. Because we don't have to think about sending a motor impulse to our heart or to the muscles of our stomach. But we're talking about voluntary. So what we're saying, folks, pretty much every motor impulse that's going to a skeletal muscle is originating from this part of the brain. And we said every skeletal muscle contraction has to have what first? A nerve impulse. So now we're seeing where that nerve impulse comes from. The primary motor cortex sends motor impulses to skeletal muscle. That's really cool. And actually, you can break it down even further. You don't have to know this. But this is a cool diagram because it shows you all the motor impulses to certain parts of the body come from different parts of the primary motor cortex. So if we've got a motor impulse going to the muscles around your knee, it's actually originating from the top of the primary motor cortex. If I've got motor impulses going to my eyeball or my mouth, like I'm talking right now, voluntarily, it's coming from a little bit further out. And the idea that there's different amounts of space given to different regions gives us an idea about how many motor impulses are required to carry out these motor functions. If you think about up top here, the trunk, hip, and the knee, I mean, the trunk is your whole torso. That's pretty big, yet there's not that much space given to your primary motor cortex because we have big, huge muscle groups there. And it doesn't take very many nerve impulses to contract them because they're big muscles, versus the muscles of our hands or our face. These require many, many more nerve impulses because we have many small muscles that are required to carry out these very fine motor actions. Thinking about writing, you've got to really contract the muscles in a different way for every letter, which is very different from the trunk. Either you bend over or you bend backward. All right, cool. Primary motor cortex sends motor impulses to our skeletal muscles. And even though you don't need to know the specific regions, you should know that there are specific regions of the motor cortex that go to different parts of the body, and that more space in the cerebral cortex is given to areas that require more fine muscle movement. And just as an aside, if you think about how we discovered this, I mean, not to be grotesque, but I mean, a lot of these things we discovered through injury. Someone, we can't purposely we can't purposely hurt someone's part of the cerebral cortex and see what part of their body stops working. That would be unethical. So think about World War II, for example. Someone had a brain injury at this part of the brain or that part of the brain, and we got to see what body motion was affected. And that helped us to paint this map. All right, that was the primary motor cortex. Another specialized area, and by the way, the primary motor cortex, these areas are motor only, right? We're doing motor only. Then we have an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area is what's outlined in this dotted line here, also in the frontal. And this is motor to muscles of speech. Speech requires a lot of things. We're going to see later that other parts of the brain are responsible for association for speech. In other words, reading a book, reading words that require some association. There's sensory feedback from your eyeball that goes to the sensory cells of your occipital lobe, but then there's association areas of your brain that process it. What do those words mean? And then what if you want to say something out loud? Well, you got to then send a nerve impulse to Broca's area. This is where all the motor impulses to the muscles of speech come from. Every word that you say requires you to move the muscles of your mouth and to produce a certain amount of air coming through your larynx, or your voice box. So all those motor impulses are coming from Broca's area. Motor for speech. Now, on your exam 4 in lecture and on the final, I'm not going to give you a labeling chart, because labeling is what we did in lab. But I could ask you where these are located. So you should know that Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and that Broca's area is motor for speech. So even though I won't ask you to label, you should still have an idea about where they are. Okay? All right, let's do some sensory. Now, what's cool is that we already talked about the primary motor cortex. So remember, we have the dividing line between the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex and the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Right at that edge, in red, we had the primary motor cortex. Well, right beside it, folks, we have our primary sensory motor cortex. Here it's called primary somatosensory, just a fancy addition there. But can we keep it simple? We can just say that here we had the primary motor cortex, where all of our motor impulses to skeletal muscle go out from. Right beside it, we have our primary sensory cortex, structured similarly like a headband. The idea that different parts of the primary somatosensory are receiving sensory from different parts of the body. The only difference is in the motor cortex, in that motor cortex picture, we were sending nerve impulses out to the body, out to the skeletal muscles. Well, in the primary somatosensory, this is where sensory nerve impulses come in. So all the sensory nerve impulses, and by the way, because we're talking about the cerebral cortex, sensory impulses from skeletal muscle and joints and skin. Again, we're not talking about sensory impulses from smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is involuntarily controlled, so sensory impulses from smooth muscle go somewhere else. We're talking about sensory impulses from skeletal muscles, joints, and the skin. So sensory impulses from your skin of your face comes to this part. Sensory impulses from the skin, joints, and muscles from your arm go up here. So the primary somatosensory cortex is where the sensory impulses from skeletal muscles, joints, skin come in. You don't need to know the specific areas here, but just like with the motor cortex, different amount of space is given to different parts. And areas that have more sensory abilities, think about your face. Your face is much more perceptible to sensory. The genitalia, I like to point that out. That's a very sensory area. So it receives, I mean, think about it, the genitalia receives just as much space as your trunk. You have more nerve endings in the genitalia. You have more nerve endings in your face and your fingers. So therefore, more area is given in the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's what it's saying here. Primary somatosensory cortex receives information from skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. Sensory only. This is only going to be where the sensory comes in. Other parts of the brain are going to process, and then if we wish to send a motor impulse out to a skeletal muscle, that's going to come from a different part of the brain. Sensory only. We also have the primary visual and primary auditory cortex. This should not be a surprise. The primary visual cortex is going to be in the occipital lobe. So this is a sensory area for vision. I know we said that most of the sensory is in the parietal, but a lot of the sensory for vision happens to be in the occipital lobe. So this is an area where we only take in sensory from the eyeball. Other parts of the brain are going to process that vision. Other parts of the brain are going to send up motor impulses to muscle. And then we have the primary auditory cortex, which, as we talked about, is in the temporal lobe, right by the ear. So all of the sensory information from our ear goes to this area. It's actually this blue area. I made my circle a little too big. Got a little carried away. What can I say? Sensory, sensory only. Only receive sensory. Other areas process it. And let's give you two areas that are examples of association areas. Prefrontal cortex and Wernicke's area. And we're almost done, folks. Thanks for bearing with me. It should not be surprising that one of our biggest association areas, the prefrontal cortex, is in the frontal. The frontal lobe not only does motor, but the frontal lobe has a lot of our decision making, which is processing. So the prefrontal cortex, it's a pretty big area in the frontal lobe. It does a lot. I'm going to pick out a couple. It is linked with our limbic system, which means that it's linked with emotions. It is needed for recall, memory, and judgment. That's what I was saying in the example of the visual information. Remember? Let's go back to the purple. We had visual information coming from the eyeball. I saw a cute guy, right? Visual information coming from the eyeball. Of course, the sensory is going to go back to the visual cortex. That's going to be a sensory area, right? The processing for that, part of the processing might come from other parts of the occipital lobe, but a lot of that processing is going to come from the prefrontal cortex. Processing, processing, processing. The prefrontal cortex takes in information from other parts of the brain to help make decisions. It's going to include emotions. Maybe I'm feeling sad and lonely, so I might be more likely to go speak to the guy. It's going to take in judgment. Maybe I'm thinking about what I'm wearing, so I take in sensory information from my legs and arms about what clothes I'm feeling against my body. Maybe I have other information about recall. Well, the last time I went up to a dude, he gave me the big N-O. So all of these things are coming into the prefrontal cortex. We've got information from the eyeball, information from the limbic system, information from our sensory cortex. So a lot of sensory information is coming into the prefrontal cortex where it's processed. And if I want to then have a motor response to it, it's not going to come from the prefrontal cortex, remember? If I want to walk towards the guy, then I've got to tell my primary motor cortex, hey, send nerve impulses to contract muscles of my legs. But a lot of our decision-making, judgment, and this is a really interesting thing to research, what makes us make the decisions that we make? What makes teenagers make some poor decisions? Lack of experience in life, hormonal levels. There's so many things to look at. But prefrontal cortex, recall, judgment, emotions. Big decision-making area, which is processing. And a second example of an area that does processing only is Wernicke's area. And this is a processing area for language. Processing area for language. That's just an easy example. We have many association areas like this, but Wernicke's area is a pretty big area. So we're talking about language, right? The sensory information, if I'm reading a textbook, the sensory information, where's it going? You guessed it, it's going back to the primary visual cortex. But I have to process it. So one of the big processing areas, particularly for trying to sound out unfamiliar words, that sensory information is going to Wernicke's area. Maybe I have some memory of a word that was similar. So I've got some information coming from the prefrontal cortex, right? Maybe I have some emotional attachment to it. Maybe I see a word that really gets my juices flowing, like Black Lives Matter, how you feel about that, which of course we know that Black lives do matter because every life matters. So the emotional part of our brain may come in. So this is an area that processes for language and speech. But remember, the motor impulses to actually move the muscles of our mouth come from the primary motor cortex. So after Wernicke's area processes all those things together, it's going to then send nerve impulses to our primary motor cortex, which then sends nerve impulses out to our skeletal muscles in our face and mouth. Isn't it amazing how all these things work together? And so quickly, it's really fascinating. Don't worry about that. Okay, so listen, folks, you can map out thousands of areas of the cerebral cortex. I've only asked you to know 7. Some are motor only, some are sensory only, some are processing or association only. Last couple things, and then we'll be done for this first video. I just want to remind you that the different cerebral hemispheres are a little bit specialized. So we have the right cerebral hemisphere and we have the left cerebral hemisphere. First off, we may remember that the left side of the cerebral cortex controls the right side of the body, and the right cerebral cortex controls the left side of the body. So for those motor impulses going out from the primary motor cortex, they're actually controlling the opposite side of the body. And in general, the left part of the brain is more about math and logic. So a scientific person may be a little bit more active in the left cerebral cortex, whereas the right hemisphere is more in control of emotion and artistic stuff. As you can see from my drawing, I'm not a very artistic person, so maybe my right hemisphere is a little bit lacking. Although I've certainly made some errors in judgment and logic, so it's not like my left is that great either. And lastly, we remember that the corpus callosum is what connects the 2 cerebellar hemispheres. So we do have to have the ability for each cerebral hemisphere to talk to each other. And the corpus callosum is what connects the 2 halves and allows information from one cerebral hemisphere to be transferred to the other cerebral hemisphere. Okay, you do not need to know basal nuclei. I am just pointing out, inside the cerebrum, we spent all that time talking only about the cerebral cortex. Well, what about the inner cerebrum? Well, most of the inner cerebrum is only sending nerve impulses from one part of the brain to another, because it's axons. There is an area of nuclei deep in the cerebrum, which would mean gray matter. Collectively, we call this group of nuclei deep in the cerebrum the basal ganglia. We don't really understand its functioning. We believe it does some of these things I've listed, but you don't need to know this. I'm only pointing out that it exists for anybody who's interested. All right, we're going to end there. In our second video of this chapter, we will pick up the rest of the parts of the brain, and of course, we'll talk about the spinal cord.